Well, good afternoon to everybody. Today we have our 19th day, UNAM Chicago y el Centro de Investigaciones de Estudios del Norte give to all of you the warmest welcome to this cycle, Diálogos del Bicentenario de las Relaciones Diplomáticas entre México y Estados Unidos. Now I'm going to introduce our participants. El Dr. Emilio Rabasa Gamboa is originally from Tuxtla Gutiérrez, Chiapas. He received his law degree and doctorate in law from UNAM. Graduating with honors, he also completed a master's degree in philosophy and political science at the University of Cambridge, England, and a diploma at Harvard University. He is currently a full-time researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM, professor of constitutional theory of constitutional law at the Law School of the UNAM, and both undergraduate and graduate level. He has taught at IPAM, UAM, UIA, UP, the Fletcher School of Law, and diplomacy in Boston, MA, and lectured at higher education institutions in Mexico, in Guanajuato, Colima, Coahuila, Acapulco, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas, Veracruz, Monterrey, Nuevo León, Jalisco, Puebla, and abroad in Cambridge and London in England, Regina in Canada, Santiago de Chile, and Valparaíso in Chile, Rome and Siena in Italy, Barcelona and Madrid in Spain, and Houston, Chicago, Kent College of Law, Washington and Boston, Harvard, MIT, Boston University, Boston College, and UMAs in the USA. In the public sector, he worked at the Mexican Social Security Institute, the Ministry of the Interior, and the National Human Rights Commission. In the diplomatic field, Dr. Rabasa served as Consul General of Mexico in Boston for New England from 2016 to 2018, and previously served as Ambassador of Mexico to the OAS for 3 years. Editorialist in several national newspapers and author and co-author of several publications in law, philosophy, and political science. Thank you so much, Dr. Rabasa, for staying with us today. It's an honor for me to stay with you and learn from all of you. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Kent Greenfield. He is an internationally recognized scholar of constitutional law and corporate governance. Kent Greenfield is a professor and the Dean's Distinguished Scholar at Boston Law School. He has authored 3 trade books, including Corporations Are People Too, and They Should Act Like It for Yale University Press. He is also the author of 2 constitutional law e-case books and the principal editor of the 2 Supreme Court volumes of Moore's Federal Practice, LexisNexis. Greenfield is a frequent public commentator on broadcast and cable news programs, having appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, and Fox. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Slate, Boston, Global, American Prospect, Nation. He has also published over 4 dozen scholarly articles in leading legal journals, including the Yale Law Journal and Virginia Law Review. Greenfield is an active participant in litigation matters pertaining to civil rights and corporate accountability. He was the founder and president of the Forum for Academic and Institutional Rights, the named plaintiff in a 2006 Supreme Court case that challenged the Pentagon's anti-gays policy. He was instrumental in developing the theory of the cases brought against Onokal Corporation and Hershey's corporations for alleged human rights violations in Burma and West Africa. Additionally, he has authored several amicus briefs in Supreme Court matters, including in the cases of Masterpiece Case Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commissions and 303 Creative versus Ellenis, arguing that the Supreme Court should not extend religious freedom rights to for-profit corporations. Having lectured at nearly 40 institutions in 45 different states and 11 countries, Greenfield has received 4 teaching awards while at Boston College, a graduate at Brown University and the University of Chicago Law School. He clerked for Justice David H. Sauer of the United States Supreme Court and practiced at Covington and Portland in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ken Greenfield, it's an honor for me to stay with you. I'm trying to do my best job. I hope that you feel comfortable. And of course, all the audience can learn from all of you, because I know it's a very great opportunity. Dr. Emilio Rabasa, we were talking about the 6 idioms at least a comparison of constitutional change in both countries, USA and Mexico, our constitutional structure, our mechanisms to enforce rights and human rights, the form of government in both constitutions, and the role and power of the highest courts in the both nations. Our Supreme Court is under criticism for being an arm of the political branches. So our first comment, it will be about what do you think about these items?
First of all, I want to thank UNAM Boston and UNAM Chicago for this wonderful organization of the bicentennial of the relationships between our two countries. I am particularly grateful to Hector, who had been very active in inviting me and reminding me that we had today this very important meeting. It is certainly for me a pleasure to be in the same space with Professor Kent Greenfield from Boston College, an institution which I got to know while I was General Consul of Mexico in Boston, and for which I have great regards. I certainly welcome the opportunity to exchange views on our two constitutions in an exercise of constitutional comparative law, something that unfortunately has not been developed regarding our two Magna Cartas. I think there is a lack of literature of a study in both constitutions. My grandfather, Oscar Rabasa, who graduated from the University of Philadelphia, studied the American legal system. And when he got back to Mexico, he wrote a treaty called Tratado de Derecho Angloamericano, Anglo-American Law Treaty, only in Spanish, where he advanced some comparison of a selected number of institutions between our two legal systems together with the English system. But it is not exactly a text on comparative constitutional law between our two texts. So I really hope that this opportunity of this conversation takes us to the possibility of writing a text for which I would kindly invite Professor Ken Greenfield about both constitutions, the constitutions of Mexico and the United States, that as we shall see during this talk, they have certain features in common, but certainly wide differences. And it is, I think, very important for partners in the Treaty of Free Commerce between ourselves and neighbors to have a clear understanding of these constitutions. My father, who was also professor of law, wrote a book about the three constitutions of Canada, United States, and Mexico, the three partners to the free trade agreement, but not exactly a comparison of the parts, the dogmatic part and the organic part of our two texts, which I believe we are still lacking. So I should understand this talk as a beginning of a wider communication between our two institutions, our two countries, between Boston College of Law and the National University of Mexico, the Institute of Legal Studies, where I work, and to further collaborate in this endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doctor. It's very interesting what you are talking about. I'm sure we have similarities with our neighborhoods, but I'm sure we have a wild differences. So it will be in the future of this talk. I'm sure we can know much more about this. Dr. Kent Greenfield.
Gracias. Buenas tardes y gracias por invitarme. Es un honor estar aquí. And forgive me for having to switch to Spanish because your English is likely better than my Spanish, although I continue to try to improve. Thank you for that very gracious introduction, Martha, and Dr. Rabasa is very, it's an honor for me to be here with you to begin this conversation. And I am absolutely dedicated to continue this conversation, not just between our two universities, but between our two nations because we are so close and yet so far in so many ways. Let me also say that it's just a pleasure for me to be here under the auspices of CISAN and UNAM, and thank you also to Hector for facilitating this. I have a soft spot for UNAM. My older son is actually living in Mexico City right now. He's a writer and teacher in Mexico City. My younger son, when we visited Mexico City, has adopted the UNAM Pumas as his favorite Mexican soccer team. So and it was sporting an UNAM Pumas jersey recently when he went to school here in Boston. And so I'm looking forward to continuing these conversations. And I hope to be able to do this in person and leave Zoom behind sooner rather than later. So maybe what I should do, just by way of introduction, is that I am very interested in learning more about the Mexican Constitution in this conversation and to do this comparative work. But let me start by talking perhaps for a few minutes about some of the things that I think are quite distinctive about the U.S. Constitution. And I think once we have this groundwork established, I think it will become clear how some of the important ways in which our constitutions differ. And I think it also the situation, it will become clear for those of you who are not in the United States why the Constitution plays such a sort of pivotal role not only in our law but also in our politics here in the United States. One of the things that I always start my introductory constitutional law class with is I invite my students, require my students to read the entire text. And if you don't know it, that might come as an assignment that seems daunting. But the Constitution of the United States is quite short. It's mine is quite worn at this point with taped edges, but it's only 5,000 words long. And so you can read it in a few minutes, cover to cover, and it's quite short, and therefore quite vague. I mean, I think that there are historical reasons why it's short. I think the amount of agreement that our founders could achieve over even very fundamental questions of the day was quite thin. And so I think they chose to write a document that was at a high level of generality, using vague generalities, and therefore left us a document that's quite thin and small. You can sort of see it there. And one of the implications of this, the other thing that I should say is that not only is it small and thin and vaguely worded, it is very hard to amend, very hard to change. In order for an amendment to go through, you have to have a supermajority, a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. And then it has to go to the states for ratification of those amendments. And 3/4 of the states, 75% of the states, have to ratify any change. And so what that means in reality is that this document has been amended very seldomly. We have only had 27 amendments in 230 years, and 10 of those occurred right at the framing, the Bill of Rights. 2 of those were right after that in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so therefore we've had 15 amendments in 200 years. The most recent one was in 1992, and that had been originally proposed in 1792. So it took 200 years for our most recent amendment to be ratified. And what's more, many of those amendments are sort of procedural or structural. You know, the capping the number of times someone can run for president, or changing the age of that you can of citizens to vote. So there aren't that many rights-based amendments, and those amendments too are written very vaguely. For example, in the 3 amendments that were passed after the Irish Civil War, one ending slavery, one guaranteeing the right to vote, regardless of race. The other is the amendment that so many of our cases are about. The 14th Amendment. It really guarantees the right of liberty, of due process, and of equal protection. And those phrases are just that general. You know, we every American citizen or every person is guaranteed liberty, but what does that mean? Well, I think what it means is that the interpretation of those words is the entire ballgame. Right? What does liberty mean? Does it mean the ability to marry someone of the same sex? Does it mean the ability to terminate your a pregnancy? Does it mean the ability to determine where your kids go to school? Those are all questions that the court has answered over time, but there's not much guidance that you can find from the text itself. So interpretation becomes key. These words, what does liberty mean? And then, of course, that turns on who decides. And early on in our constitutional history, our Supreme Court said, well, it's us who decides. We are the last, we have the last say in what the law is. And what that has meant is that in the United States, we have the most powerful Supreme Court of anywhere in the world. We have the most powerful judiciary of anywhere in the world. The judiciary can strike down laws that both other branches of government, the presidency and the Congress, both think are constitutional, both think are appropriate. And not only does this power of so-called judicial review extend to the Supreme Court, but also extends to any federal judge anywhere in the country. In fact, there was just an argument yesterday at the United States Supreme Court about a law, about actually a guidance that the Biden administration had put into place about who should be deported or not, where our limited enforcement resources should be placed. And there was, and that guidance that President Biden had put in place was struck down by one federal judge in Texas, and that single judge was able to stop the entire Biden effort to prioritize who should be deported and who should not. So I think the thing to note is that because our Constitution is so vague, so general, it in effect shifts so much power to the judiciary to say what the law is, and that power is pretty deeply embedded, not just in the Supreme Court, but in every single federal judge around the country. And I think that has impacts on our politics, who gets to appoint these judges, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. It makes a huge difference in the lives of everyday Americans in ways that might strike some from other countries as unusual or even inappropriate. So let me pause there.
Thank you so much. I think the key is, as you said, USA 7 articles. Mexico has 136 articles, less changes or modifications. It means the key is interpretation and confidence, maybe in the system, maybe in the judges. What do you think about this, Dr. Rabasa?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the extension issue. No? Certainly, that is a huge difference. Ours is 136 articles long, whereas the U.S. Constitution has only 5 articles, although each article has a section, and in each section there are several sub-articles. So all in all, if we add them all, it is certainly more than 5, but never 136. How can we explain this? History. Mexico belongs to a tradition, constitutional tradition, which started in the Constitution of 1824. We have had 3 federal constitutions, 1824, 1857, 1917, where the framers were to a certain extent influenced by the European tradition of white texts, of long texts. If you check on the Spanish Constitution, on the German Constitution, on the French Constitution, they are not short texts as the American one. They are also long texts. So we belong to that long text tradition where the framers, the so-called fathers of the Constitution, sought to establish not only the wide principles of government, but the whole structure of the state. As in the Constitution of the United States, it is divided in 2 parts, the so-called dogmatic part that is concerned with the Bill of Rights, and the organic part, which is concerned with the organization of the Mexican state at large, not only at federal level, but also at local level. The framers of the American Constitution were not bound by that European tradition. Their metropolis was England. It was Great Britain, which has a non-written constitution. So the reference was not the type of long written text. That's why they searched for something smaller, more straightforward. And also, we must remember that this was the second intent after the text of the Confederation failed, and they decided to go for the Federation text. So that explains why it's not capricious, it's historical, the difference in size between the two texts. The American text is more straightforward with the division of powers, starting with the legislative branch in Article 1st, then the executive branch in Article 2, and then the judicial branch in Article 3, and then Article 4 on the federation. They never include, except in Article 4, Section 3, they don't include a wide definition of the form of government, whereas we do have it in Article 40. the only thing they established in this section is Article 4, Section 3(2) says, Section 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. That's the only mention of republic in reference to the states, whereas we have a wide concept in Article 40 of our Constitution says it is the will of the Mexican people to establish a republic, representative, federative, democratic, and then there was a lighter, a recent reform related to laicism. So we have a huge definition of our form of government in Article 40 of the Constitution. And then there are several articles that are dedicated to establish all the rules of this form of government, of the republic, of the representation, of the federation, of democracy, and of laicism in religion. That makes a big difference. The other big difference was mentioned by Professor Ken Greenfield, and it's very important. In 200 years, or more than 200 years of the existence of the American constitutions, as he mentioned, you have had not more than 30 reforms, 27, and most of them, at least 10, regarding the Bill of Rights, whereas we have now gathered 700 reforms only in the Constitution of 1917, not considering the reforms of the Constitution of 1857, which were also in the hundreds. But just referring to our Constitution of 1917, who just accomplished his centennial, first constitution that has lived for more than 100 years in Mexico, 700 constitutional reforms. Why? There is also an explanation which was mentioned by Professor Kent. Americans are bound by the tradition of judicial interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. The Constitution is what the Supreme Court, the justices, says is the Constitution. Say is the Constitution. So they are the reformers of the Constitution. For example, and he mentioned it quite clearly just recently regarding abortion. Before it was permitted, now it is prohibited. Or regarding the rights of marriage of persons of the same sex. We are bound by a different tradition, also very much European, continental, very French, which is we rely not so much on the interpretation of our Supreme Court to actualize our Constitution, but on the legislative branch, on our legislators. We change our Constitution by legislative process, not by judicial process. And that is a wide difference because it requires the whole process of constitutional reform, 2/3 majority of Congress, simple majority of the states, etc., which is a very complicated process. But so far, we are still bound by it to the extent that while we are talking now, there is a new bill of a constitutional reform about electoral organization of elections. Now, right at this moment, the big issue in Mexico, the big political issue for which there were two recent public manifestations in the streets, one on the 13th, another one on the 27th, is the constitutional reform of the electoral system. The López Obrador administration has a view of that organization, which is different from the present organization, and wants to change it. But he doesn't have the majority in Congress to do so. So we are still holding to that practice of constitutional change and constitutional reform through the legislative process, not through the judicial process. This doesn't mean that our Supreme Court does not interpret the Constitution and also in that interpretation hold different views. As a matter of fact, they just passed a resolution yesterday, very, very important and very delicate, about the permanence of the military on the streets beyond 2024. This is a new interpretation of the Constitution, because before that resolution, it said they could only be outside by the call of the executive branch up to 2024. And Mr. López Obrador sent a bill to expand that time to more than 2024, to 2029. It went through a whole series of debates, and finally, the Supreme Court yesterday ruled that yes, they can remain beyond 2024. Now, that is a very significant interpretation of the Constitution on the text of the remaining of the troops of the army in the barracks or in the streets. So we have the two systems, but certainly the most important one, the strongest one, the prevalent one, is the legislative, not the judicial. Whereas in the United States, as Professor Kent mentioned, it is the judicial. So I would say that these are the two biggest differences between our two constitutions: the extent and the constitutional reform process. There are others, of course, but mainly these are the two more significant.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Dr. Kent, I think about why Dr. Rabasa was challenged. It should be the judge rolling a play like a permanent legislator, or there are two difference. Is this working like mechanisms to enforce rights, or do you think you need to change something?
Right. What an interesting question. Because in part, as I mentioned before, our Constitution is so vaguely worded, and our conception of rights is so dependent on judges, as Dr. Rabasa has mentioned. I think we have actually a very constrained view of rights and rights enforcement here. And let me just say a few more things about that broadly. I think one of the things that I've noticed about the U.S. Constitution compared to others around the world is that we are much stingier, much less robust in our explicit recognition of rights. We have a few here. The Bill of Rights is of course listed among our most important rights as U.S. citizens. The First Amendment is about religion and speech. You have our protections of criminal defendants in the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments. But we don't. And then, of course, in the 14th Amendment, after the Civil War, you have some protection of equality, some protection of liberty. but there's no protection of many substantive and affirmative rights. You don't have an affirmative right to education. You don't have an affirmative right to housing. You don't have an affirmative right to a dignified income. You don't have an affirmative right to a safe environment. You don't have an affirmative right to healthcare. All of which you see in varying degrees in other national constitutions. So those rights are not, when they exist, they don't come usually from courts. They have to come from legislatures. And then you have to look again at our legislative structure. And here, again, I think the United States has taken a view that the structure that this original document created makes it incredibly difficult to get anything done. And you've probably been seeing this from afar here in the United States. In order to get a law passed, a proposal has to go through the House of Representatives, then the Senate, then it gets signed by the president. And it's quite rare for all three of those bodies to be in the hands of the same party. And even when so, there are many impediments built into the system, sort of not really in the Constitution, but quasi-constitutional, like the filibuster in the Senate, which requires a supermajority vote to get things through the Senate. And so what that means, you have a huge bias toward the status quo and a difficulty for the federal government to legislate. And I'm amazed to hear that you've had 700 constitutional reforms in a little over a century. It would be amazing to have our Congress being able to agree on anything 700 times over the course of a century. And I think the problem arises in particular in the areas of electoral reform, as Dr. Rabasa has mentioned, because here in the United States, there's always going to be an embedded incumbency that doesn't want constitutional or electoral reform, and those reforms are incredibly difficult to effectuate by way of the bodies that benefit from the current status quo. Courts do not feel empowered to change that, or courts have not to date been empowered to change that, except around the edges. And so we find ourselves, and I'm sure as you've looked at from afar, in sort of this stagnant nature where it's states can take away voting rights. There's lack of clarity around presidential succession in some circumstances, like we saw around January 6th. And I think it's and so much of this really I lay at the feet of the framers who created the system. And let me just make something else explicit about the reason why we find ourselves here in the United States at this place. And I think once you sort of peel away the history of our original document, created 230 years ago, it had to come to terms with our nation's original sin, which is slavery. We could not ratify this document without the agreement of the Southern states, and the Southern states would not agree to join a national compact that didn't guarantee the ability of the Southern states to maintain slavery for certain periods of time into the future. And it took us, a century and a civil war to end slavery, and a civil war that cost the lives of over 500,000 Americans. But the vestiges of slavery still exist in this document, and I'm not just talking about the fugitive slave clause that obligated states to return slaves to their masters, or the 3/5 clause that gave Southern states extra representation in Congress based on the number of people they enslaved. I'm talking about the very framework of our Constitution that preserved the power of small rural states in the United States Senate, for example, which was in part embedded on the notion of the framers had to protect the interest of slave owning states in the Senate, and by extension, their presidency, because as you may know, our presidential system is sort of a state by state vote based on the number of electoral votes. Electoral votes are in part based on the number of people it's basically the total of the number of people in Congress they have plus the number of senators. And mathematically, that gives states like Wyoming, which is rural, underpopulated, disproportionate amount of power both in the Senate and in the presidency. And so you have states like Texas or like California that are underrepresented in the Senate, underrepresented in the presidential elections. And so what you have is you have a sort of an embedded status quo orientation and difficulty in trying to amend this document to make legislative changes. And so when we think about, I think the real threats to a continued vibrant democracy that we are experiencing here in the United States, protections of voting rights, protections of basic ability to live, protections of healthcare, protections of people on the basis of their sexual orientation and race and sex. Those things really cannot be dependent any longer on courts. They have to be dependent on our legislature and our Congress. And there are, and Congress itself is skewed because of this document in favor of rural and less populated places, and it allows sort of the existing status quo to be embedded in the law. And I think this is an enduring difficulty that the United States is going to have to face. And it doesn't sound like, Dr. Rabasa, that Mexico faces the same kind of embedded status quo bias.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greenfield. Dr. Rabasa, would you like to add something about this important item about?
Yes, I certainly agree with Professor Kent's comments and the embedment of the status quo in the United States and in Mexico. We have presented the main difference between our two constitutions. There are, of course, another similarities, mostly, I would say, in the judicial branch, for example. Some Mexican historians believed that our federation was a copy of the American Federation of your constitutions. Even my father, who was a constitutional professor, thought so, that the American Constitution had influenced our Constitutional Congress of 1824 to establish the Federation in Mexico. I made some research about it and found out that it is not the case. If we compare, for example, the articles of both texts regarding the Federation, they are absolutely quite different. But not only that, paradoxically, the root of our Federation was brought from the Constitution of Cadiz, when they developed what was called the provincial deputies that were implanted in Mexico and that grew up as the states. So the roots, the origins of our federation is different from the Federation of the United States. Other than that, there is also similarity regarding the constitutional reform process of 2/3 majority, although the United States requires also 2/3 in the states, and we require only simple majority. But we could make a long list of similarities. I am happy to hear that Dr. Kent also referred to the rights. This is also another theme very, very important. We tend to put rights in our Constitution every time we can. As a matter of fact, our Constitution of 1917 was born with what was called the social rights, like rights of the peasants and rights of the labormen, in Articles 27 and 123. And then we established the right of housing and the rights of health, etc., etc., etc. Although those rights have not been fully extended so far into the population. But we are also very established in our text. Now, having said this, I would like to, if we still have 5 minutes, to issue that is very much at present, and it is that some years we not happen either in the Constitution of the United States, Constitution of Mexico. Both were texts that were, let's say, untouchable from any political force. But now, with the rise of populism in both countries, the United States under Trump and ours, there is the question, to what extent is our constitutions, our respective constitutions, exposed to this movement of populism? For me, what happened in the United States on the 6th of January 2021 was a brutal attack of Trump to the Constitution of the United States, and also all the interference he made in trying to revert the electoral results, even calling local officials to try to find votes for him. So that was a strong attack on your Constitution. Do you think that the both texts are still under that high risk of populism attack?
I do. I don't want to speak for Mexico, but I certainly think that our Constitution, and in fact our political structure is continues to be under at risk for those kinds of attacks. And one of the reasons I think that is that, in part because that there's so many compromises that we've papered over or lived through over the last 230 years. And the oddity about that January 6th, I think it was an attempted coup, essentially. What was happening there was, both sides thought they were fighting on behalf of the Constitution. And that cannot be true. Both sides were not fighting on behalf of the Constitution. But our difficulty is that our Constitution is written at such a high level of generality, both sides can think that. But the reality is that that cannot be true, and we have to make it much more explicit here in the United States that so many things that we have entrusted to the president, for example, is really not in the text, but is a product of norms. And so all I would say is that I think one of the things that became clear after January 6th is so much of what we depend on here in the United States is a product of norm and product of principles of adherence to fidelity to the Constitution rather than what's in the text itself. And I think the failure of Donald Trump in particular to abide by those norms, I think exposes the weakness of our constitutional text to address these kinds of outlandish situations.
What really amazed me, and I am very, very gratefully surprised, is the resilience of both constitutions. In both cases, not to let populism undertake the constitution in each country. Whereas in the United States and in Mexico, which means that the constitutional mechanism to protect the supremacy of the Constitution above all existing powers is still working. And I am very, very happy for that. Unfortunately, we are 5 minutes to 1. I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank Marta, the moderator, and mostly I want to thank my colleague, Ken Greenfield. I hope we continue to collaborate between our two institutions and maybe come up with a comparative constitutional text between the Mexican and the American Constitution in English and Spanish. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Héctor Zavala.
Vamos al tri, ¿no?
Vamos a,
thank you so
well,
much,
very difficult,
Rabasa.
but yes.
I don't want to talk about football. I don't know nothing about that. But I want to thank to all of you, of course. Esmeralda Martínez, Samuel Martínez, Salvador España, who are people who work with Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte de la UNAM. Desde luego a Alberto Fonserrada, que es de la UNAM Chicago, y a Héctor Zavala de UNAM Boston, and all the people who work with CISAN, UNAM, and absolutely our most grateful thank to Dr. Rabasa, Dr. Kengrip, and please, I want to apologize because of the trouble we have here just for a few minutes. It's been an honor, and I'm sure it will be this dialogue, it will be contribute to legal knowledge and absolutely to improve and understand and take better practices about everything we are talking about, our constitutional changes and of course mechanisms to enforce rights and human rights. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Let Mexico win.